is Karoline Kenville, and I am an executive clinical director at a company called Laugh Learn. We're a small business here in Metro Detroit and have a clinic in Grand Blanc. I'm also a professor at Purdue Global University. I teach in the Department of Psychology and in their Applied Behavior Analysis program. This is my 6th time speaking for the Alliance, so I feel honored and privileged to have all of you here. And this topic is really good for clinicians or parents, and it's also really good for insurance providers also. So it kind of covers a little bit of everybody here. Before I begin, I kind of want to get to know who my audience is. So raise your hand if you are a provider in the field. Okay, providers, great. Parents, awesome. And anybody work for insurance or any other area? Okay, good. That will help me kind of guide some of the topics. I feel like every year when Colleen kind of reaches out for having conversations about what to talk about, it always comes down to quality care and ethical services. So it's kind of what we're going to wrap around, and we're really going to look at the assessment process and how we also identify our clinical recommendations. I think that's a gap that we kind of miss in the clinician side, and bridging that to kind of give some more information. So just to clarify, everything in the presentation today mostly comes from the BACB, which is the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. This board governs our certifications. They set our ethical standards and our guidelines. Also from the Council of Autism Providers, they kind of help with accreditations and looking for those quality services. And then also the Association of Professional Behavior Analysts. They host a lot of great conferences, actually one coming up here soon. And then also I'm going to talk about a couple of research articles and some research that has some longevity as well. As we dive in today too, please feel free to ask questions. I am open to open engagement. If you see something on the slide, shoot your hand up and let's ask the question. I want this to be kind of an open conversation. I don't have enough time to go through all of the information I would like to share today. So I'm kind of just touching on a little bit of it. After the presentation, if you prefer to, you're going to have my contact information. More than happy to reach out to you, help give some resources or some direction on any of the topics today. So just real quick and talk about some introduction, we really want to make sure that we're promoting the advocacy of the best interest of our clients that we work for. Who is the client? Always is the question I sometimes hear. The client is actually the individual who is the recipient of the Applied Behavior Analysis Services in ABA. Sometimes it includes the stakeholders or the caregivers to the point at which they receive the direct training or consultation. So when us as clinicians are creating treatment plans or coming up with assessments or looking at a clinical recommendation, we have to look at the child or the individual that we're working with directly, okay? That's who we have to advocate for. This comes right out of the ethics according to the BACB, which is 3.01, the responsibility to the client, and then also 3.2, which is advocating for appropriate services. And we're going to dive into that today. Some of the key features of ABA, I'm not going to dive into it a lot about ABA. We can save that topic for another day, but just an overview. ABA really advocates for early intervention for its best outcomes. There's a lot of evidence that supports that the earlier the treatment begins, the greater likelihood of positive long-term outcomes. Behavior, it's a natural science, so applied behavior analysis really looks at that physical and social environment and how we can manipulate that environment in order to make change in behavior. Designing and implementing effective ABA interventions for people with autism involve many variables, and I think oftentimes when we talk about ABA, we don't really dive into what those variables are, so we're going to kind of brush over those today. All programs within ABA have to be customized and individualized. There's not a blanket system for ABA. So if you're a parent and you're asking questions at an ABA provider, you really want to understand how they individualize their programs, because no individual with autism is the same. Just the way that the programs need to be run, they need to make sure that they're looking at your child as an individual and a developing child. They also need to be flexible to ensure that we can accommodate change and making sure that change can occur over time. So just because we start with a treatment plan at one point doesn't necessarily mean that's what it stays at. There has to have flexibility to ebb and flow as the child grows and develops. So things to consider with ABA and clinical recommendations. You have to look at how autism manifests in the individual and impacts the entire family. One example I like to give here is I have one of the clinics we work at, we have a family of 3, and all 3 of them are impacted by autism, and it looks different in all 3 of them. However, one of the children, she has a lot of great academic skills, if you will, but we're seeing some challenging behaviors, but also looking at those challenging behaviors within the whole household, and how can we address that services now to impact the whole family and how it manifests with the whole family. You have to have an objective assessment. This is a topic I'm passionate about. We can't just submit assessments based on parent report or updating goals. You really have to have that eyes-on component with that assessment. So you're doing an assessment, you grab that Vineland or maybe the AFOs, and you just get the parent report, and then you submit that treatment plan. It's really appropriate for us to really have all 3 components where we're reviewing the files, objectively watching the individual to come up with a behavior plan and the treatment plan, and then also that writing process. Treatment may vary based on duration and intensity. We're going to talk about that today. I think it's really important for parents to understand how that process works. ABA treatment requires high levels of case supervision to ensure effective outcomes. I'm going to talk about the ethics of that as well. The field of ABA has grown so fast and so quickly that I think there's a lot of room that I think we can, as clinicians in the field, help bridge that gap to ensure we're sticking close to the integrity of the field. I think it's also important to note that the complexity of treatment goals and the extent of direct treatment really also depends on that individual, right? Oftentimes people say, oh, they're 5 years old, let's go ahead and graduate them out of ABA, but that might not be necessarily appropriate for them. Let's think about long-term goals and what are some of those life goals as well, and how we can spread those out into the community. So when we talk about recommendations for ABA treatment, we look at the medical services and the intervention. It's a medical service and it's an intervention for individuals with autism. So it is covered by insurance, which if it's covered by insurance, it typically means that it's an evidence-based approach, which there's a plethora of research that supports that the effectiveness of ABA is there. Many variables and considerations are put into treatment. We're going to talk about some of those today just to create some clarity. And then also the intensity of treatment or the dosage varies across children, and we have to look at all of these variables to create a clinical recommendation. I think sometimes, if I can just be candid with you guys, some of the students that I work with was like, oh, well, they're 5 years old and they're this, so they need 40 hours. Well, do they? Have you looked at all of the variables within it, or just assuming that that's what the child needs because they kind of fall in that same category? We want to look at the difference between focused ABA and comprehensive ABA. We're going to look at that today and what that means and how we get there. Do we have any BCBAs in here? Nice. Okay, awesome. So focused ABA is really focused on maybe 1 or 2 behaviors or a couple goals. The intensity level ranges from anywhere from 10 to 25 hours, but that's with a caveat. So what I mean by here is that the intensity may need to be higher depending on the nature of the target behaviors and other considerations. Individuals for each client, for instance, behaviors that put the client or others at risk or harm might need to be increased in those hours of focused ABA. You see a lot of focused ABA, particularly with the school-aged population, on those evening hours where you kind of focus on just some of those like a smaller amount of behaviors or skills. The reduction of hours, and you look at the reduction of hours and the maladaptive behavior, so it's also a good opportunity to move from a comprehensive to a focus if you're looking to reduce hours or fade out of ABA. Again, all of the clinical recommendations are really based on medical necessity. So when you're talking to insurance companies, it's really good to bring in that medical necessity component. Let's be honest, they're a business too. And we've had plenty of conversations where we have to advocate for our client and what our clinical recommendation is. More than happy to have separate conversations on how to navigate some of that as well, if needed. That's something that we specialize at our company with too. So comprehensive ABA is anywhere from 30 to 40 hours per week to achieve meaningful improvements. There's a lot of research that supports a comprehensive approach to ABA. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a behavior analyst. My doctorate's in early child development, so I really look at the developing child, not just ABA. We're looking at comprehensive ABA. You look at multiple areas of development domains that are effective. So the cognitive, the communicative, social, emotional, adaptive functioning, maladaptive behaviors. Again, it's based on medical necessity. So when you look at focus and you look at comprehensive, you really got to look at those developmental domains. What impact do they have? How far are they from their developmental peers? Going back to that same 5-year-old who I was like, oh, they're ready to graduate to go to school. Well, is that a clinical recommendation? How far behind of their peers are they, right? If they're still 3 years behind their peers, that would give me some concern as they go into school full time, right? And they're in an environment with people who are 3 years ahead of them. So we have to consider those things. We can't just look at age or circumstances in their life for a clinical recommendation. I'll talk more about that too as we go through. How to identify whether you need to do a focused or a comprehensive plan. So looking at assessments results, we provide assessments as behavior analysts that we have 2 main assessments that we really work with, but we use those results to kind of help guide where that clinical recommendation is. It doesn't end there though. We really should be looking at how, again, autism manifests the individual and the family, looking at that developmental gap, behaviors that are barriers to learning. That doesn't mean aggressive behaviors all the time. What are some of the stereotypy that you might see that could be a barrier to learning? Do they have challenges or barriers with generalization of skill? If you teach one skill, do you have to teach another skill and then go back and reteach that skill because maintenance is a challenge? Those are barriers to learning. Barriers associated with cognitive, communication, social, emotional, adaptive functioning, and maladaptive behaviors, those all need to be considered in that clinical recommendation. Generalization and maintenance, again, going back to can they do it in multiple environments? One of the things that I tell my students and during class is if we don't plan for generalization now, when you start ABA services, what's going to happen is when they go out in the community, if we can't teach them to do these things across multiple locations, in the community, at home, at school, what good are we doing in the clinic? It also should be noted when you are doing clinical recommendations that the time the client spends in activities such as school and other therapies should not be counted or deducted from the recommendation hours of ABA treatment. So during supervision, while I'm working with my graduate students, I tell them, what's the clinical recommendation? You have to put that in your report, right? Well, what if they go to school for these many hours, so I'm going to take off 10 hours. That's not the clinical recommendation. That might be what hours they're able to provide services, but what's the clinical recommendation? And as clinicians and BCBAs, we want to stand firm on that because we've been provided skills to help make that decision. This is just another quick overview. With the assessments too, you can also look at comparative norms. I know that the VP MAP assessment does a really good job at helping bring those comparative norms in. We'll talk about that also. So other considerations for treatment and intensity is looking at the health and safety, the skill deficits, the dangerous behavior. Are there other health issues going on? What biological barriers are occurring that could be interfering with ABA? How do we address that and then go into ABA? The complexity of treatment protocols needed for success. If you need a complex treatment plan to work with the individual, then you really probably have to increase those hours also, right? Because it's going to require more supervision and more support, more consistency. The family dynamic and community also, going back to that same family who's impacted by 3 children, you have to look at the whole family who are all impacted to that, and what behaviors could one child learn from the other, and how can they progress into the future. We always have to really focus on trying to be preventative on the front end. Lack of progress or increased rates of progress. Sometimes progress is slow, right? And we know in the field of ABAs, BCBAs, that it's not a job that you get rewards quickly, you get rewards long term, right? When you see the graphs, like, oh my goodness, those progress, the progress they're making, sometimes it's not quick reinforcement, if you will. Transitions for continuity of care. So transitions into school, or transitions to the community, or transitions to another ABA company is really important on what that looks like, and can also affect the dosage of your clinical recommendation also. I do want to make sure I make this point too. So this comes right out of our ethics as well. Assessments are extremely important in this process when you're looking at those clinical recommendations, and it's selecting, designing, implementing assessments before selecting and designing behavior change interventions. So we have to do assessments in order for us to be able to create a behavior change intervention. We really want to make sure that we're diving into the needs of that individual, the client, and then also including some of those stakeholders. So if you are an individual and you have a child who's looking for ABA or considering it, this is a really important piece to understand, is no matter where you go, each ABA company should be doing their own assessment. So let's say you start off at one company and you decide to transfer somewhere else. If they don't do another assessment, you question that, okay? Because they should. I can't take your results and say, oh yeah, this is what we're gonna do. We should really be doing our own assessments with that. And then it also works on the focus on maximizing benefits and then minimizing the risk of harm to the client and stakeholders, especially when it comes to those self-interest behaviors. I want to talk about the VB map, and I want to talk about, this is one of the starting points of identifying clinical recommendations. The VB map is the Verbal Milestones Assessment and Placement Program. It's really an assessment that looks at the developing child, so it's a developmental assessment across 3 levels. It's focused on 0 to 84 months. There's 5 elements that is developmentally sequenced, and then language acquisition. One of the things I like to comment about the VB map and comparing it to the developing child is, during some of the training or working with my staff, I explain to families also, when you think about a typically developing child, I want you to think about a skyscraper at night in Chicago, right? Sometimes there are some lights on and some lights off, and it looks pretty and it's all lit up in some areas. That's kind of like what you see with an individual with autism. So a developing child might have the lights on the bottom and they're growing skills and the lights are all turning on, and you're building skills on top of each other. Whereas when you work with individuals with autism, going back to none of them being the same, none of the skyscrapers are the same. Because some skills, they might have really good foundational skills here and some great skills up here, but we're missing the gap right here. And it's our job to make sure we fill those gaps so that it kind of builds back on top of each other. Does that make sense? I think that's super important, and my point to that is the VB map does a really good job at doing that, because it looks at skills from an early level and moves all the way up. And then really quick too, just because it's an assessment for 0 to 48 months doesn't mean that that child has to be at that biological age. It might be just where they're at developmentally, and that's okay. I like to transition to another assessment after a period of time, but you can use that up to like 7 or 8 sometimes even. The ABLES is the assessment of basic language and learning skills. It's really for birth to 12 years old, but the primary content in that assessment is primary ages 2 to 6, and is less developmentally sequenced. However, this assessment also does really look at some of those other complex living skills. It's a nice transition to some of those independent skills. It focuses on eating, hand washing, bathing, a little bit of that in there. The social component, and it does have a good language component, but the VB map is very language heavy. So the research, when we talk about the intensity of ABA, one of the questions that I have recently when we've done onboarding or working with different families is, where did you get this number and why? Why is my 3-year-old or 5-year-old being recommended 37 hours of ABA or 40 hours of ABA? Why is that? Comprehensive treatment has heavily supported in the effective treatment outcomes. So going back to that comprehensive and focus, there's a plethora of research that really supports that early intervention and then a comprehensive approach. So looking back to Aldevrick and his research, it's been replicated multiple times. Those are just a few of the replications early on. It's been replicated multiple times though. That at least 36 of direct ABA treatment per week for at least 2 years is associated with clinically significant, reliable change in cognitive and adaptive skills. So sometimes when you see, if you're a parent and you're like, oh wow, I have 40 hours of ABA, that's a lot. It's a lot of intensive treatment. It is, but that's where the research can support maybe for that case to be the most effective. I think it's important to understand that whether treatment should be focused or comprehensive, the intensity of treatment should be based on medical necessity, first and foremost, and then also each individual child rather than the child's chronological age, duration of treatment, or the nature of previous ABA services or like, right? So we have to just look at where that child's at in that moment to come up with those clinical recommendations. High treatment intensity, such as 36 hours or more per week, was the only variable that independently predicted the IQ change and adaptive gains in multiple research led by Aldevrick and replicated by others. I have a whole little library on any of that. If anyone wants access to that, email me at the end. I don't mind sending you some of that research, but super helpful, especially if you're talking to parents trying to explain, like, how did I come up with this clinical recommendation and what does the research say? So essentially, why is this important? Because according to the BACB, determinations of whether ABA treatment should be focused or comprehensive should be based on medical necessity, the treatment of each individual client rather than the client's chronological age, duration, nature of previous ABA services. I know I just said that, but I think it's really important to know it, especially as BCBAs, we get emotional about some of that, and we're like, oh, well, what if this or this, but we really have to look at that clinical part of it, right? Keep our clinical hats on making those decisions. Locations of treatment can happen anywhere, right? And there's ways that we as BCBAs can help advocate for these. There was a period of time, so I've been in the field since 2009, before there was a Michigan mandate, and things have changed significantly. I've seen them start off one way, and then they change it, and they go out to another way back. So for an example, when we first started, you could do ABA in the community, you could do it here, you could do it there, and then all of a sudden they took it away from us. They're like, no, it has to be in home or in a clinic. And now they're starting to come back with their peer reviews. We had a couple peer reviews where they're like, well, what are you doing for generalization? I was like, well, 10 years ago I tried, and now it's coming back. So it's really good to see that, especially from the insurance side and advocating for that. Treatment can happen in the home. It can happen at the grocery store. It can happen in school. It can happen at Home Depot, at the park. It can happen in clinic centers, outpatients. We even go to baseball games with one of our kids to really help on those social skills. Residential settings and inpatient in hospitals. I know Harbor Oaks is, I think, the closest one around here that provides ABA service plus an inpatient facility. And focused and comprehensive also can be done in any of those environments. So for you guys that need to know that, it's changing. We're getting there. And that's also from CAS. This is right from CAS's website. So I always refer back to that when I'm talking to insurance. Like, well, actually, the BACB says this, CAS says this, so authorize this. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And be one way and come home, totally flip the script. Would it be more beneficial for her to do the in-home ABA services?
That's a great question. question. And I'm going to talk about the parent-caregiver portion towards the end of the presentation, but just to address that quickly, going back to that generalization, if you're not seeing it across environments and you're seeing great things at school and in home, or I'm sorry, in school and in the clinic, but then you're maybe not seeing the same things at home, that's where I would strongly encourage maybe doing some in-home ABA or looking at that parent-caregiver training. And parent and caregiver training looks a little different. It's not the same as direct ABA, right? You're still mom at the end of the day, and you should still be mom, right? Allow those technicians maybe to help support that. Case-by-case situation, but to answer that, especially as they get older, I think making sure they can generalize them to home is really important. So, you're welcome. All right, so for insurance authorizations, I am really passionate about this, especially for parents as I advocate for them, and then, relating to the fellow BCBAs in the audiences. I just want to be honest about this. Insurance company is a business too, right? They argue with us all the time about our authorizations. Well, why do you have that goal? Well, because of this, okay? We'll deduct 2 hours because I don't think that's medical necessity, and then I got to rewrite it to make it medical necessity. And that's our job as behavior analysts, is to advocate for our families in that, right? But one of the things that I've learned has been really helpful is understanding the Michigan mandate and the laws that are around that. I have a friend of mine who works for insurance, and she goes, yeah, Karoline, it's our job to reduce authorization hours, and that's sad, right? But I also get where they're coming from on the business side, but at the same time, I'm like, we got to advocate for these children. So, want more information on this? More than happy to share with you. I don't have time today. We're going to briefly go through this. Case supervision and caregiver training services should be rendered in addition to services delivered directly to the client. So, I'll give an example. I had a phone call one time where insurance, I was advocating for 37.7 hours for a client, plus 8 hours of supervision, plus 4 hours of parent training, and they were trying to say, well, because you're asking for these additional, 11 hours, we're going to reduce the client's hours to 27.7 hours. And I was like, well, you can't do that. Why? Why can't you do that? Because that's not what the Michigan mandate says, and that's not what the BACB says also. So what it says is that as a BCBA, how do you advocate for this? You can request 8 to 10 hours of assessment. The only challenge with that is sometimes we get denied, right? Because it does take longer. Like we get 8 hours of assessment, let's say. It really takes us like 12 to 16 hours to do an assessment, to write it and be proper. When you're allowed to request anywhere from 8 to 10, but you've got to make sure you have the rationale and the supplemental assessments. And I think as clinicians, if I can just be honest myself, guilty, we tend to forget those additional pieces and how we can make that medical necessity. The 20% supervision is a service model, right? So we, at our clinic, we require to request 20% supervision, and we also try to really push to make sure that everyone's getting 20% supervision. So for an example, I'll break down some of what that looks like on the next slide. But it's really important when you're talking to insurance and those authorizations to have all of those rationales. To the extent when I'm writing goals for my clients, I put goal rationale at the very bottom. So there's no question at why we're doing this. It's already there. That does also help increase the authorization, getting those authorizations. I do want you to refer to the BACB and then, of course, the Michigan Autism Mandate for more information too, or you can contact me and I can help provide it to you. When we talk about intensity of supervision, supervision has a huge impact on the quality of services and also the outcome of services. So whether you're a BCBA or you're a parent looking for services, this is a great question to ask. Or you're looking for a new job, or how much supervision do you provide your clients? The BACB recommends, and this picture is actually right from their website, 2 hours of supervision for every 10 hours of direct ABA, 4 for 20, 6 for 30. Protocol modification is where I'm observing with my eyes what's going on, I'm reviewing the data, I'm going to make a modification, then I'm going to go ahead and show my technicians and my staff what that looks like. It's not just always the eyes-on component. Developing a behavior plan, writing it out. It's really important for us to have operational definitions. So that way, when I write a behavior plan, I can go to my staff and say, this is the behavior plan. I'm going to show you. Last year, I spoke about BST, behavior skills training, and how important that is with supervision. So not only do they need to talk about and explain the behavior plan, they also need to model that behavior plan to their technician in order for them to make sure we're touching all of those bases in supervision. At least 50% of it should be direct eyes on observing. This is a huge thing in our field. We get a lot of paperwork. We have a lot of administrative work. But as a parent, I would want you to advocate for your child, or advocate for your child. Is someone watching him and engage in these behaviors, and are they making clinical decisions and updating those treatment plans based on that? So, for an example, if we go back here, if I've got 8 hours of supervision, the bare minimum 4 hours of those should be eyes on, right next to that client, working alongside them and supervising with them. Questions on that? Yeah.
I guess the most relevant to what you just said, I've always wondered, what actually is the function of the behavior technician? Why doesn't the BCBA just carry out their own treatment?
That's a great question. So it goes back to the service model, and I can also send you this too. It kind of does like a tiered service model is what it's called, where there's a BCBA and there's a technician. I think a lot of that has to do with making sure we can service more than one population while supervising. That's why the board also came up with the RBT, the Registered Behavior Technician Certification, which I strongly encourage any technician to complete that process, because it does talk about those basic principles of ABA. Kind of goes through that first course that you would have, and then you take an exam on it and get certified. But following that service model, being able to service and reach more than one person. Extremely. It's my job is to work myself out of a job as a BCBA, and that's what I strive to do. I'm going to get emotional on that, but the point is there's so much need. We get calls weekly, sometimes daily, looking for services, looking for direction, and it's heartbreaking. But that's where me coming into these conferences and talking about the importance of sticking to the integrity of our field is so important, because the field has grown so fast. And I think when you have rapid growth like that, there are a lot of opportunities for cutting corners, or maybe let's, pack our clinic like sardines so that way we can, profit or whatever. Like, you can lose the scope, if I can just be honest. Well, really, I personally don't want to stand behind any of that. I want to make sure we stay to the integrity and doing what's right, so that way these children can get services and hopefully move on, and we can take someone else. Does that make sense?
My other question was related to medical necessity. I feel like that gets thrown around a lot, but no one actually explains what it means. Like, in your expertise, how does one determine whether or not ABA is medically necessary?
Oh, that's a great question. And touching on that a little bit earlier, what's that? Oh. Was it your question? Oh, okay.
Oh. It's like, it just gets thrown around, and I feel like medical necessity can change depending upon what you're working in. For example, Casey and I are diagnosticians. We actually recommend the ABA service. So what we may feel is medically necessary may differ from what you feel is medically necessary.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, and I agree. Like, I always tell my clinicians, if you're on a phone call with insurance and they want to know medical necessity, you better know why, right? You better know why you count every single one of those hours that you're recommending, and if you don't, let's have a conversation about it, right? Going back, taking a couple steps back, you've got to look at like those maladaptive behaviors. If there's aggressive behaviors, they're causing harm to themselves. I always encourage, it's a little bit safer to get more, right? Because we don't want them to hurt themselves or others. And especially if you have a little child who's growing up to be an adult one day, if we don't address those behaviors now, it can be a lot more challenging. Going back to what my doctorate's in is early child development in human studies. That first 5 years of a child's life is where the most impact in brain development occurs. So if we can make impact within those first 5, maybe 6 years of that child's life, we have an opportunity to make have those better outcomes. And that is a statement that I share with insurance all the time. It's medical necessity. I got 2 years before this child's 6, and it's going to be a lot harder to change their behaviors, because if you look at the neuroscience and the way that the brain develops, it develops so quickly between that window of time that afterwards it slows down because different parts of the brain's developing, that it's really hard to change behavior. If I've got a 16-year-old who's engaging in severe aggressive behavior but has great cognitive skills, 4.0 student, I might request a little bit more because he's going to be 18 soon. And that's my concern. What if he harms somebody and doesn't really even mean to harm somebody, or harms himself so bad, right? I look at those behaviors first, and that, obviously cognitive skill, right? Where are they at cognitively? What's going on in the family? Do they have a long history of autism? And how has that affected their family, that medical history component? Those are the 3 things that I look at. I do get really frustrated when I hear, oh, they're 5, they're time to go to school. And I'm like, but they're engaged in these aggressive behaviors. They're harming themselves. How are they going to be able to build social relationships when they're doing that, right? Looking at the longevity. So not just what's right now, but what can I see happen 5, 6 years down the road? Does that answer it? Yeah, no problem. Okay, so caregiver training. I gotta check the time here. Oh boy, okay. Caregiver training is something that I feel just now recently is getting a lot more attention on, and I think it's really, really important also, because when we talk about generalization of skills in the treatment setting or at home and in community, we need that caregiver buy-in, right? And that's hard. We all have lives, right? We work, we have this practice, this after school. We've got to somehow, I think also in the field of ABA, find ways to really make it make sense. Go to those baseball games now that insurance companies are approving more of those authorizations. Go to the grocery store. Mom, do you have to go grocery shopping on Saturday? Cool, let's practice this. We'll go with you. Okay, and it might be scary. I see your face. That might be scary, but let us do the work. Yeah, let us do the work. You keep grocery shopping. Let us do the work, right? That's what we're here for. That's what we're trained in. We also have to look at with caregiver training is the treatment of co-occurring behavior disorders that risk the health and safety of other children in the home and community. We want to make sure that we can help create quality of life through those development of those social skills, right? That's really reinforcing. There's a lot of research in the social emotional world about relationships. How can we help develop and support that realm also? We want to also look at the adaptive training. Are they able to brush their teeth? I can only teach so much in the clinic, right? Sometimes I just need your house. Sometimes I need your bathroom, or I need going to a restaurant with you to teach you how to teach ordering food or social appropriateness when in public. And looking at functional replacement behavior. So sometimes at home, just like going back to your question up here, is they're doing great things here, but sometimes it has to be taught, especially with autism. You might have to teach all of these behaviors in separate environments, and that's okay, but that's what we're equipped to do. So if I can understand the frustration of like, oh, they're doing great in school, and the teacher raves about them, or the technician raves about them, that's great to hear they're doing progress, and I can understand where maybe you're feeling frustrated on the home front. It's also really important for caregiver training and support is to have relationship building with family members, right? I often hear about family members who say, oh, I would just love it if you could play with his sibling, or, the aggressive behaviors are so intense, the sibling wants nothing to do with them, we can't go anywhere together as a family. Those situations break my heart. How can we pull them together and help that family unit? And that's what happens in that caregiver training. I think a really important piece to that is caregiver training really needs to be individualized, just like ABA treatment. Sure, there are caregiver training curriculums out there, just like there's ABA curriculums, but you have to make sure we're individualizing those. Caregiver training is not just reviewing your child's treatment plans or goals. It's deeper than that. That's a really important part. But what are we doing in the clinic, and how can we do that at home? That might require some data collection or graphing, or bringing that data in so we can graph it and measure to see how the child's doing at home, or coming in and do observations. I know that's intrusive, because it is your home and that's where you reside, and a lot of privacy happens there, but I promise you, none of us judge. We're really here to support. Mm-hmm.
And she came, and she wasn't even certified, which was probably my first red flag.
Yeah.
But however, she came and she was supposed to spend 3 hours with my child, and would leave once she didn't pay attention to her anymore. She couldn't keep her attention. So I was like, that's why I had asked.
Yeah.
Would it be beneficial for her to continue doing it in-home or be in center? So that's what I think.
Maybe just check out different provider opportunities. Maybe someone else has a different skill in that area and they can help support. Yeah. Okay. All right. So really quick, there's a lot of ethics in regards to treatment considerations, and I think I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to speed through this, but my email address will be on the last slide if you want these slides for your own use. So considerations with treatment considerations. What considerations does behavioral analysts have to consider before starting ABA? What does that look like for continuing ABA and then transitioning out of ABA? That's another topic I'm really passionate about, and I would love to do a presentation alone on that, because sometimes, Blue Cross, let's just give an example. Last year, Blue Cross Blue Shield approved coverage for ABA service for a lifetime. So what does that tell you about ABA? It's not effective just for your 5 and 6-year-old, right? It's for a lifetime. I think it's really important too when we write discharge reports, if there is a child who's transitioning out of ABA, let's say, to be careful what we write in there, because then the insurance company can come back and argue, well, they discharged, they mastered it, they graduated. We want to be careful because we want to make sure that door is open because services might be needed later. Starting ABA, a whole bunch of ethical considerations here. Again, selecting and designing the implementation of assessments. I talked about selecting and designing, implementing behavior change interventions. That's the course I actually teach at Purdue, and it's so important because if you don't have all the components of it, you can actually have some major barriers in the treatment plan and progress. So as a parent, I want you to ask about, okay, how do you select, design, and implement the behavior change procedure? That's a great question for them to ask, or for you to ask them. Minimizing the risk of behavior change intervention. So sometimes it's the most seemingly simple intervention. I'm going to give you an example. I worked with a client in one of our clinics and working with the BCPA, and there was all these fancy, well-written behavior plans, and they tried it for about a week, and I was like, nope, one simple thing. He just needs some routine. And sure enough, it was a rough 3 days, because we call that extinction burst, where the behavior gets worse before it gets better. And before you know it, he's doing amazing. So sometimes complex behavior plans aren't necessary. And I think those are great questions. If you're a parent, you're like, this seems really complex. Explain to me why something more simple isn't going to work, or can we try something more simple? The complexity of those behavior plans can get messy. And then we have to remember, going back to that tier model, making sure that it's able to be consistently ran. Describing behavior change interventions before implementation. So this is a really awesome question too. So if you have a BCPA that you're working with and they just give you a behavior plan and let you read it, and if you're a technician or RBT, it is actually their ethical responsibility to describe it and model it and train the technician on it before they implement it. Super passionate about that part of it also. And then continuing ethical considerations, I'm just going to briefly go over this. I want to talk about the transition part. Collecting and using data. If they're not collecting data and they're not graphing it, they're not doing ABA. That's goes back to Skinner 101, right? Continuous evaluation of behavior change interventions. They need to be looking at that. Our rule in our clinic is anywhere from 3 to 5 days. You better have that graph open. I want you looking at it. Because what does research models say? That you can see and identify trends in data within 3 to 5 data points, right? So if I have 3 days and your child's there for 40 hours, they're going to have at least anywhere from 6 to 10 data points that I should be able to identify a trend. And if they're not identifying trends and it's all over the place, a lot of variable data, that tells you the intervention's not working, most likely, right? What can I do to change it? You got to have those eyes in there. And then 219, addressing conditions for interfering in service delivery. So this is a huge topic. There are a lot of biological barriers sometimes that interfere with services, and we have to educate ourselves on that. And that goes back to that parent-caregiver training. We're noticing this. I've noticed this, this, and this, and this, and their bowel movements, or their eating habits, or we've noticed this. We're wondering if there's additional things going on. Let's go to the doctor. I'll help you find somewhere to take them. I'm going to give you a quick example of this. Is I worked with a child who engaged in self-injury behavior, open hand hit to her head. It was pretty intense to the point where she would get scabs on her forehead. It was heartbreaking. We couldn't figure out what was going on, so I was like, let's start tracking her bowel movements and how often she urinates. There's got to be something else going on here. Long story short, we started tracking what she ate, and we came to the hypothesis that she had some allergic reactions to like 3 things. And then we taught her, the mom was like, well, we can't take her to an allergist. There's no way she's going to be able to sit. We're going to teach her to sit. I'm going to teach her to sit for 20 minutes still for you so we can get this allergy test. Granted, this was a 2-year process. We got her to sit for the allergy test and come to find out there were 5 things that she was allergic to, and one of them was soy. And that was one of our hypotheses because we looked at her food that she was eating. Come to find out, once we removed all 5 of those things in her diet, guess what happened? Her behaviors went down to like 3 or 4 a day from like 400 or 500 frequencies. Beautiful day. I actually have the graph framed in my office because it's just beautiful. So we have to address those biological barriers. As parents, please don't get frustrated when you're like, I'm not seeing change, but question, what other barriers are there that we just might not be able to see and my child's not able to communicate? The last piece on the transitioning of ABA ethical considerations, this is another hot topic I wish I could spend the full hour discussing. Discharging services should be reviewed and evaluated, and discharge began. In the middle of the treatment period, if you say, oh, they're ready to discharge, have you done an assessment? What is the most recent assessment that has been completed? The client no longer meets the diagnostic criteria for ASD. That is right there on the BACD's website, transitional services. Do they still meet the criteria for ASD? Yes or no? If they do, then ABA service, there are other things that we can work on as clinicians. The client does not demonstrate progress towards goals or successive authorization periods. If there's not progress, then of course we have to look at other barriers. What are those barriers to that progress? Going back to biological, we have to address that, and that's what it's referring to. The family's interest in discontinuing services, of course, we respect that. And then when there are questions about the appropriateness or effectiveness of services in individual case, again, oftentimes it goes back to those biological barriers. There's a lot of research that supports this one and that one as well, is oftentimes there's a barrier that we just can't control that makes ABA ineffective, but the 90% of the other time is extremely effective. So in summary, clinical recommendations are not and should not be decided lightly. Recommendations should be eligible for authorization through insurance. If you say, as a BCBA, my clinical recommendation is 37.7 hours, that's what the board and CASP and also Blue Cross say should be authorized. You just have to make sure you have your rationale and your wording right, essentially. Early intervention is extremely important. The earlier you can get services, that doesn't only apply in ABA, that really applies across early child development across the board. Comprehensive ABA has shown to provide the lasting results over focused ABA. They're both fantastic. I'm an advocate of it, of course, but comprehensive, when you see those larger numbers, like, oh my goodness, 40 hours, just know the research really supports that has the most lasting results. Caregiver involvement is essential to support generalization, extremely important, and supervision from a BCBA is essential. Supervision from the BCBA really has a huge impact on the quality of services as well as the outcome. If you're not getting a lot of supervision from your BCBA, then I would also question, the efficiency of the work that's going on.